Picture this. 3 weeks after a car crash left me with 2 cracked ribs, a mild concussion, and a body that still hadn't remembered how to stand up straight without wincing, my own father stood in his doorway and told me the storm outside was safer for me than the inside of his house. That's the sentence that split my life into a before and an after. Tell me, if you're watching this, drop where you're tuning in from, because I have a feeling some of you already know exactly what it feels like to give everything to the people who raised you and still end up standing outside their door. I didn't grow up believing my family would do something like this. I grew up believing love simply came with terms I hadn't finished paying off yet. My name is Marin Ashworth. I was 29 years old, an emergency room nurse on the overnight shift, a single mother to a 4-year-old named Ren, and for 6 years I had quietly been the reason my father's auto shop chain hadn't already gone under. Not with applause. Not with thanks, just with every spare dollar I had, wired into an account I never asked to see the books for, because that's what daughters like me learn to do without being told twice. It started small, the way these things always do. A missed loan payment my father needed covered, just this once. A payroll gap the month before Christmas. A supplier threatening to pull inventory unless somebody wired 4 figures by Friday. Each time, I told myself it was temporary, that once the shop stabilized, once my father finally hired the accountant he kept promising to hire, the calls asking for money would stop. They never did. By the 3rd year, I stopped keeping track of how much I'd given. I told myself keeping track would only make it hurt more. The accident happened on a Tuesday in late October. Black ice on a bridge outside Duluth, a spin-out, a guardrail that did its job just well enough to keep me alive, and just poorly enough to leave 2 ribs cracked and my skull ringing for weeks afterward. Ren wasn't in the car. That was the only mercy in the whole thing. I spent 4 days in a hospital bed staring at a ceiling, calculating how many shifts I'd miss, how many bills I'd fall behind on, and somewhere in that math, my apartment lease quietly expired without me having the strength to renew it in time. So when I finally called my father to ask if Ren and I could stay with him for a few nights while I sorted out a new place, I didn't expect celebration. I expected, at minimum, a roof. I was still healing. I was still dizzy some mornings when I stood too fast. I thought that alone might be enough to soften him. I drove up on a Friday evening with the last of the daylight already gone. Snow starting to fall in that slow, deceptive way that always turns into something worse an hour later. Ren was asleep in her car seat, her small mittened hand curled against her cheek, when I pulled into my father's driveway. I sat there a moment longer than I needed to, gathering whatever strength I had left before going inside. My father, Walter, opened the door before I'd even made it up the steps, like he'd been standing there rehearsing. Behind him, in the doorway to the living room, my younger sister Cassidy leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, already wearing the smile she wore whenever she knew something I didn't. "You're here," Walter said. Not a question, not relief. A verdict, already reached before I'd said a word. "I just need somewhere warm for a few nights," I said, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "I'm still healing, Dad. Ren's freezing in the car." He didn't glance toward the car. He didn't ask about the accident, or the ribs, or whether I'd slept more than 4 hours a night since the crash. Instead, he lifted a folder from the side table by the door and tapped it against his palm, like a countdown he'd already started without me. "Renata at the bank says the shop closes in 60 days unless somebody signs against your mother's trust," he said. "You're the only signature that matters." My stomach dropped straight through the porch boards. My mother had died 4 years earlier, and the trust she'd left, modest but mine, had come with a letter specifically stating it wasn't to be touched by the business. She'd written it that way on purpose. She'd known exactly what would happen to it otherwise. "Dad, that money isn't collateral," I said. "It's the only thing she left me. She wrote specifically that it wasn't for the shop." Cassidy pushed off the doorframe, her voice light, almost bored, the way she always sounded right before she said something designed to cut. "She left it to you because she felt guilty for favoring you your whole life. Not because you earned it. Sign it over, or don't bother coming in." "I have a concussion," I said, my voice cracking now, no longer able to hold the careful, reasonable tone I'd practiced in the car. "I have a 4-year-old asleep outside in the cold. Please, I'm not asking for money. I'm asking for a bed for a few nights." Walter's jaw did the thing it always did right before he stopped listening entirely. A tightening at the hinge, like a door being locked from the inside. You've had 6 years to save this family the easy way. Instead, you sit on it. You want shelter tonight? Then earn it tonight. Sign the papers. I can't do that to her future, I said, nodding toward the car, toward Ren. That trust is supposed to be for her someday. Then you can't do this, he said, and stepped back, pulling the door wide, not to let me in, but to show me exactly what waited behind me. The driveway. The street. The storm already swallowing the porch light at the end of the block. Go sit with your principals somewhere else tonight. The wind found me the second the words left his mouth, like it had been waiting for permission. I stumbled backward down the steps, my ribs screaming with the sudden motion, snow already collecting in the collar of my coat. Cassidy called after me from the doorway, almost cheerful now that the decision had been made for her. Don't act shocked, she said. You always thought you were better than the rest of us for holding on to that money like it made you special. I got Ren out of the back seat because I couldn't leave her alone in a car that was rapidly losing its heat, and I held her against my chest on the open driveway, while behind us, my father's porch light clicked off, not accidentally, not from a timer, but flipped, deliberate, final. I tried the car again, nothing. The battery that had somehow survived a highway accident 3 weeks earlier chose that exact night to die completely. Ren woke up crying almost immediately, her small hands already stiffening in the cold despite her mittens, and I stood there in the driveway of the house I grew up in, realizing with a kind of clarity that only real fear produces, that I might not be strong enough, not with cracked ribs, not with a concussion still ringing behind my eyes, to keep both of us warm long enough to see morning. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough that the shaking stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like something else, something quieter and more dangerous. Long enough that Ren's crying softened into a thin, exhausted whimper against my collarbone. I remember thinking, with a strange, floating calm, that this was possibly how it ended. Not dramatically, just quietly, on a driveway 20 feet from a door that wouldn't open, and then headlights. Not my father's porch light flickering back to life with some late arrival of conscience, but 3 black SUVs turning off the main road, engines low and steady, moving with the kind of purpose that told me immediately this wasn't a passerby stopping to help a stranded car. Doors opened before the vehicles had fully stopped. A man in a long wool coat crossed the snow toward us at a near run, already pulling a thermal blanket free from under his arm. "Marin Ashworth?" he said, and something in the way he said my full name, certain, urgent, like he'd said it in his head 100 times already, told me this was no accident. I didn't have the strength left to ask how he knew it. The last thing I remember before the cold finally won was his voice, low and steady, cutting through the wind. "Your great aunt sent us. You're safe now." I didn't know I had a great aunt. Warmth returned before anything else did. Not comfortable warmth, but the sharp, stinging kind that makes frostbitten skin ache as feeling forces its way back in. I gasped, and the gasping hurt, and the hurting told me, with something close to relief, that I was still alive. The porch was gone, the wind was gone. In its place, soft overhead lighting, the low hum of monitors, the particular hush of a room built for people who don't wait in ordinary hallways. "My daughter," I managed. My voice barely more than breath scraped raw. A nurse in navy scrubs appeared at my side almost instantly, her hand steady on my shoulder. "She's here, she's stable. Some frostbite on her fingers, nothing that won't heal completely. You're both safe." Safe. The word didn't fit anywhere in the version of the world I'd left behind an hour earlier. I pushed myself upright despite the sharp protest from my ribs and took in the room. Not a standard hospital ward, but something quieter, warmer. Wood paneling instead of white tile. A reading chair tucked into the corner. Equipment that looked less like an emergency bay and more like something built into a private residence. "Where am I?" I asked. "Callaway Private Medical Wing," she said gently, like the name should mean something to me. It didn't. Not yet. "You came in with hypothermia, a partially re-injured rib, and severe exhaustion. Your little girl is doing remarkably well, all things considered." The door opened before I could ask anything further. A man stepped in. Not a physician, though he carried the same clipped precision in his movements, gray threaded through dark hair at the temples, a wool coat still damp with melted snow draped over one arm. It took me a moment to place him as the man from the driveway, the one whose voice had followed me into the dark. "You're awake," he said, and something in his shoulders eased, like a held breath finally releasing. "Good. You gave us quite a scare. Who are you?" I asked. "What is this place? What happened to my car, my—" "One question at a time," he said, not unkindly, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "My name is Preston Voss. I'm the personal attorney for your great-aunt, Vivian Calloway." "I don't have a great-aunt." The words came out flat, automatic, the same sentence I'd said my entire life whenever the subject of extended family came up, because that's what I'd always been told. No one else. Just us, and whatever us decided I deserved that week. Preston's expression shifted, something quieter settling into it. Not judgment, something closer to sympathy carefully restrained. "You were told that. It wasn't true." He set a folder on the edge of the bed but didn't open it, his hand resting flat on top of it instead, like he wasn't ready yet either. "Before we get into any of that, there's someone who's been waiting to see you." A second nurse wheeled in a small, temperature-controlled bassinet, and inside it, wrapped snug in cream fleece, was Wren, color back in her cheeks, one small fist curled near her chin, breathing in that deep, even rhythm that only comes with real sleep. I reached for her with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking and pulled her carefully against my chest, feeling the weight of her settle there like the only solid thing left in the world. "She's going to be completely fine," Preston said, stepping back to give me the moment, his voice softening. "You both are." When I could finally trust my voice again, I asked the question that had been circling since the driveway. "How did you find us?" "We were in the middle of nowhere. My father's street doesn't even have working streetlights." Preston's expression grew more careful. "A signal. Your late mother wore a pendant your great-aunt gave her decades ago, a keepsake, before the two of them had a falling out that was never repaired. When your mother passed, the pendant came to you among her belongings. What you may not know is that it had a small locator chip embedded inside the clasp. Vivian had it monitored quietly for years, in case you were ever in real danger and had no one else to call." My hand went instinctively to my collarbone, to the small silver pendant I'd worn every day since my mother's funeral without once taking it off. I'd always assumed it was purely sentimental, a piece of jewelry, nothing more. I hadn't known it had been watching over me the entire time, in its own quiet, mechanical way. "Why would she care about me at all?" I asked. "I've never even heard her name before tonight." Preston's voice steadied, deliberate now, like he was choosing each word carefully. "Because you're her only living relative, and as of 2 nights ago, her sole heir." The room seemed to tilt slightly, the way it had on the icy bridge 3 weeks earlier. "Her heir to what?" "Calloway Freight and Logistics," he said. "One of the largest privately held freight networks in the Midwest. Vivian built it from a single delivery truck 51 years ago. You inherit controlling ownership of the company, along with an estate valued at just over $410 million. I stared at him, waiting for the sentence to rearrange itself into something that made sense. "It never did. That's not possible. I never met this woman. My mother never once mentioned her, not in 29 years. Your mother and Vivian were estranged before you were born," Preston said, his tone careful, like he was handling something fragile. "A falling out over the business, over money, over pride. The specifics matter less right now than what came after. Vivian tried for years to reconnect. Letters, phone calls, attempts through intermediaries, lawyers, anyone who might get a message through. Every single one of them was intercepted or refused before it ever reached your mother, and later, before it ever reached you." Something cold settled in my chest, colder than the storm I'd just survived. Intercepted by who? Preston held my gaze steadily, like he'd known this part would be the hardest to say. "Your father." I felt something inside me go very still, the way water goes still, right before it freezes over completely. All those years he told me there was no one else. All those years he insisted I was the only thing standing between the family and ruin, that if I didn't provide, no one would. He'd known. The entire time, he'd known there was a fortune sitting one honest phone call away, and he'd buried it, Because a daughter with somewhere else to go, someone else who wanted her, wasn't a daughter he could keep quietly bankrolling his shop for 6 years running. Why didn't she just come find me herself, in person? I asked, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. Preston hesitated in a way that made my chest tighten before he even spoke. She intended to. She'd scheduled a meeting with you for next Tuesday. The transfer documents were already drafted, waiting on her signature. He paused, and I watched him choose his next words with visible care. I'm sorry, Marin. Vivian passed away 2 nights ago. Her heart, it had been failing for months, longer than she let anyone know. She was aware we were close to finding you. She knew before she went that you'd be protected. She simply didn't get the chance to hear your voice herself. I didn't cry immediately. The grief hadn't caught up with the shock yet. Grief for a woman I'd never met, who had apparently spent years quietly trying to reach me while I froze on a porch 20 minutes from a house that might have saved me months earlier if I'd only known to ask for it. Preston reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope, my name written across the front in slanted, deliberate handwriting that belonged to no one I'd ever known. She wrote this for you several months ago, he said, setting it gently in my free hand, careful of Ren still nestled against my chest, in case there wasn't time left for anything else. I held it a long moment before opening it, Ren's small weight anchoring me to the bed, to the room, to the fact that whatever this letter said, the two of us had already survived the worst part of the night. Marin, if you're reading this, I didn't make it long enough to meet you, and I am sorrier for that than I have the words to say properly. I watched from a distance far longer than I should have, hoping, foolishly, that your father would eventually do the right thing on his own. He never did, and I won't waste this letter on him. What I need you to know is this. You come from people who built things out of nothing, with their hands and their nerve, who refused to stay small just because someone told them to. You were never meant to spend your life being useful to people who never once stopped to ask if you were all right. Everything I built is yours now, not as an apology for the years we lost, as a beginning for the years you have left. Take care of your daughter, take care of yourself first, for once, and when you're ready, build something that actually belongs to you. With more love than I ever got the chance to show you in person, Vivian, I pressed the letter against my chest, next to Ren, and let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry since the accident. Not from pain this time, but from the strange, disorienting ache of discovering, at 29 years old, that someone out there had wanted me, actively, deliberately, for years, without me ever knowing to hope for it. There's one more thing you should understand before you rest, Preston said quietly, once my breathing had steadied. Your father and your sister have no idea you survived tonight, and they certainly have no idea who you've become in the last few hours. Something cold and clear settled over me, replacing the last of the shaking. They will, I said, soon. Preston studied me for a moment, something like quiet approval crossing his face before he nodded once and stepped back to let the nurse finish her checks. I looked down at Ren, her small chest rising and falling in that steady, unbothered rhythm only children manage after surviving something they'll never fully remember, and for the first time since the porch light clicked off behind me, I let myself believe that the worst night of my life might also, somehow, turn out to be the beginning of something else entirely. I woke the next morning to a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years, not the tense, watchful quiet of my father's house, where silence usually meant someone was deciding what to be angry about next, but something steadier, something that didn't ask anything of me. Ren slept in a bassinet beside my bed, her breathing slow and even, one small hand curled around the edge of the blanket like she'd claimed it as hers sometime in the night. Healing, I would learn over the following days, wasn't the relief I'd expected it to be. It was work. Deliberate, sometimes painful work, carried out by a team of people Vivian had apparently arranged for, long before I ever knew her name, a physical therapist who came twice a day to help loosen the tightness that had settled into my ribs since the accident, a postpartum trained nurse practitioner who checked on both Ren and me with a thoroughness I'd never once received in my own hospital's overnight shifts, and a counselor who visited every other afternoon and never once made me feel like healing on someone else's schedule was a weakness. You're carrying more than just the ribs, the counselor said during our second session, watching me carefully as I worked through a breathing exercise she'd walked me through. The accident, the porch. 6 years of being the only one holding your father's business together. That's not something a few nights of good sleep undoes. I don't know how to not carry it, I admitted. I've been doing it so long I don't remember what my shoulders feel like without it. Then we'll find out together, she said simply, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone's patience with me didn't come with an invoice attached. The physical therapy was, without question, the hardest part of each day. My body had absorbed the accident, then the cold, then the raw physical strain of holding Ren against me for however long we'd stood in that driveway, and every stretch the therapist guided me through seemed to uncover another layer of pain I hadn't known was still there. During the first real session, I cried. Not from the pain itself, though it was considerable, but from the strange disorientation of someone spending an hour focused entirely on helping me instead of extracting something from me. "You're doing remarkably well," the therapist said, guiding my arm through a slow rotation. "Better than most people 3 weeks post-injury, actually. You're stronger than you're giving yourself credit for." I wasn't sure I believed her yet, but I wanted to. Between sessions, Preston began walking me through what he called the fundamentals, a crash course in Callaway freight and logistics, delivered gradually, patiently, in a converted study lined with binders and a wall screen that looped live freight data from terminals scattered across 4 states. It was, at first, completely overwhelming, like being handed the keys to something enormous and told to drive it without ever having sat behind a wheel. But slowly, over days, patterns started to surface. Numbers I didn't understand on Monday made sense by Thursday. Terms that had seemed like a foreign language settled into something closer to fluency. On my 5th day in the Callaway residence, Renata Kim joined one of our sessions, a woman with sharp, kind eyes and her dark hair pulled back in a severe, efficient knot, who I'd later learn had been Vivian's CFO for 11 years. "Renata Kim," she said, extending a hand with the kind of firm, unhurried grip that told me immediately she didn't waste time on people she didn't respect. "I worked alongside Vivian for over a decade. She talked about you more than you'd expect, for someone she'd never actually met." "She did?" I asked, still not fully used to hearing sentences like that about myself. "Constantly," Renata said, something warm crossing her otherwise composed expression. She used to say her sister's line ran deeper than this company ever would, even before she had a name to put to it. I think, in her own way, she'd already decided you mattered, long before we tracked down which driveway you were standing in. The words settled into me slower than I expected, like something being repaired one thread at a time. I'd spent 6 years believing my worth to my family was measured entirely in what I could provide. Money wired at midnight, favors called in, silence kept about what it cost me. Here, in this house I'd never heard of a week earlier, a woman I'd never met had apparently believed in me without ever collecting a single favor in return. Over the 2 weeks that followed, my days settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in years, like it was building towards something, instead of simply holding something else together. Mornings began with physical therapy, followed by a light breakfast with Ren, who had taken with startling speed to the quiet luxury of the Callaway residence, the wide windows, the garden terrace, a nursery stocked with toys I couldn't have afforded on 6 months of nursing shifts. Afternoons belonged to Renata and Preston, working through the fundamentals of freight logistics, corporate governance, and the particular language of boardrooms I'd never once expected to need. It was during the 2nd week that Preston brought me a folder I hadn't asked for. "Before we go further into training," he said, setting it carefully on the table between us, "I think it's important you understand the full picture of what your father's business situation actually is. Not the version he's told you, the version the numbers tell." I opened it slowly. Page after page of financials, most of them worse than I'd ever been allowed to see in 6 years of quietly funding the gaps. Debts far beyond anything I'd covered, a pattern of missed payments stretching back further than I'd realized, creditors circling with an urgency that suggested the shop's 60-day deadline wasn't the first ultimatum, just the loudest one. "He never showed me any of this," I said quietly. "He'd just call and tell me how much he needed." "That was likely deliberate," Renata said, not unkindly. "It's difficult to say no to a number when you don't have the context to question it." I closed the folder slowly, something hardening in my chest that hadn't been there before. "How long has the shop actually been failing?" "Years," Preston said, Long before your mother passed, your contributions didn't save the business, Marin. They delayed its collapse. There's a difference, and I think it's one you deserve to understand clearly. I sat with that for a long moment, watching Wren through the study window as she toddled across the garden terrace with Miss Avery, the nanny Renata had arranged, trailing patiently behind her. 6 years of midnight wire transfers. 6 years of missed vacations, deferred savings, a smaller apartment than I could have otherwise afforded, all in service of delaying an outcome that had apparently been inevitable from the start. "I want to see the video," I said finally. Preston's expression shifted, something careful entering it. "The security footage from the night of the storm?" "Yes." He hesitated only a moment before nodding, pulling out his tablet and cueing the file. "Footage recovered," he explained. "From a neighbor's exterior camera 3 houses down, angled just enough to catch the edge of my father's driveway." I watched myself on the screen, smaller and colder looking than I remembered feeling in the moment, stumbling backward as the door shut behind me. I heard my father's voice, tinny through the small speaker. "You want shelter? Then earn it." I heard Cassidy's laugh drift out from somewhere behind him. I watched it twice. My hands didn't shake either time. "They don't know I survived the night," I said quietly, setting the tablet down. "They definitely don't know who I am now." "No," Preston agreed, which becomes relevant rather quickly, actually. He pulled a second folder from beneath the first. "3 days ago, your father and sister requested an emergency meeting with Callaway Freight, under the name Ashworth Auto Group. They're asking for a substantial bridge investment to keep the shop from closing." Something cold and very still moved through me. "They're asking me for money. Without knowing it's me." "They're asking the Callaway estate," Preston corrected gently, "which, as of 2 weeks ago, is entirely under your control." I looked down at my hands, at the faint bruising along my knuckles that hadn't fully faded yet, and felt the last of my hesitation settle into something firmer. "I want to be in the room when they ask," I said. "Not visible. I want to hear what they say when they think no one who matters to me is listening." Renata studied me for a moment, something like quiet respect crossing her face. "I can arrange that." 2 days later, I stood behind a mirrored panel in a private observation room at Callaway headquarters, Renata beside me, Wren napping in a portable bassinet in the corner, while my father and Cassidy sat across a long conference table from a Callaway representative, introduced only as speaking on behalf of the estate. My father looked smaller than I remembered him, thinner through the shoulders, his collar loose around a neck that used to fill it out entirely. Cassidy wore a coat that was working hard to look more expensive than it likely was. "We appreciate you taking the meeting," my father said, folding his hands on the table in the particular way he did whenever he wanted to appear humble and in control simultaneously. "The shop's been in the family 30 years. We're simply asking for bridge capital to get through the winter season. We'd expect to repay within 18 months. And I understand there was another daughter involved in the business at one point," the representative said, glancing down at a folder as though confirming a minor detail. "Is she part of this request?" My father's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, in a way I recognized instantly from years of watching for it. "She's not involved anymore. She left. She was struggling, honestly," Cassidy added, her voice smooth, almost sympathetic. "After a car accident a few weeks back, she wasn't thinking clearly. It's better this way. For everyone, really." I stood very still behind the glass, Renata's hand landing briefly on my shoulder, steady and grounding. "If she came to you asking for help," the representative said carefully, "would the family take her back in?" "No," my father said, without a single beat of hesitation. "She made her choice that night. We've moved forward without her." Cassidy leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as though sharing a confidence. "Honestly, it's been more peaceful since she left. She always made everything so dramatic." I'd expected the words to land harder than they did. Instead, something in my chest went quiet. The particular quiet that comes when a question you've carried your whole life finally gets answered plainly, without room left for doubt. They weren't going to change. They'd simply been waiting, all along, for a version of me they could still use. "I've heard everything I need to," I said softly, and stepped back from the glass before the meeting had even concluded, Renata following close behind. I didn't wait for another meeting arranged through intermediaries. 3 days later, I walked into that same conference room myself. No mirrored glass between us this time, wearing a charcoal suit instead of the coat I'd been wearing the night they'd left me in the snow. My father and Cassidy were still seated, reviewing follow-up paperwork with Renata across the table, when the door opened. My father's face moved through several expressions in the span of 2 seconds, confusion first, then recognition, and finally something that looked almost like fear settling into the lines around his eyes. "Marin," he said, his voice cracking on the second syllable, like the name itself had caught him off guard. Cassidy shot up out of her chair so fast it scraped against the floor. How are you even alive?" I said, crossing to the head of the table, the seat Renata had quietly cleared for me an hour earlier. "Standing. And apparently, the exact person you've been asking money from for the last week." I sat down and folded my hands the way I'd practiced in the mirror that morning, steady, unhurried. "Sit," I said, and after a moment they did. Some habits don't disappear just because the balance of power in a room has shifted entirely. "We thought," my father started, his voice already unraveling. "You thought I froze in your driveway," I said evenly. "You didn't stay long enough to find out either way." Cassidy's chin trembled in that practiced way I'd watched her perform since childhood, whenever tears needed to arrive on cue. "We panicked, Marin. It was cold. We weren't thinking straight. You had time to turn off the porch light," I said quietly. "That takes a decision, not panic." My father's hands flattened against the table's surface, his knuckles paling. "Whatever this is, whoever you're working for now, we're still your family. The shop is still failing. We need help, Marin. Please." "I'm not working for Callaway Freight," I said. "I own it." The silence that followed was the kind I'd waited my entire adult life to hear, settle over a room like this. "That's not possible," my father said finally, though every trace of certainty had already drained out of his voice. "Vivian Callaway was my great-aunt," I said. "She spent years trying to reach me. Letters, phone calls. You intercepted every single one of them before they ever got to Mom, and later, before they ever got to me." I watched the color leave his face in real time, watched something in him understand exactly how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath him. "You knew there was an entire branch of family on Mom's side this whole time, and you buried it, because a daughter with somewhere else to go isn't nearly as useful as one who believes she has nowhere." "Marin, please," Cassidy said, her voice fraying at the edges now. "We'll do anything. I already know exactly what you're both capable of doing," I said. "I have security footage from 3 houses down the street that proves it in your own voices." I let that sentence sit in the room exactly as long as it needed to. "This meeting is over," I said, rising from the chair. "My answer is no. To the loan, and to whatever you thought this relationship still owed you." My father lurched forward as I turned to leave, and one of Renata's security staff stepped smoothly between us, before he'd covered even half the distance. "You'll regret this," he said, his composure finally splintering into something uglier, something closer to the man who'd shoved a door shut on a snowstorm. "We're your blood, Marin." "Blood doesn't make a family," I said, not turning back. "Staying does. You didn't." I walked out, and for the first time since that porch, the cold didn't follow me down the hallway. He filed suit 11 days later, not against me directly, but against the Callaway estate itself, claiming through an attorney that as Ren's grandfather and my closest living relative prior to Vivian's death, he was entitled to a family maintenance allocation from the estate, on the grounds that he'd financially supported me for years and deserved recompense now that the roles had reversed. Preston called it, without much diplomacy, the legal equivalent of a Hail Mary from a man with nothing left to lose. "He's hoping you'll settle quietly to make the embarrassment disappear," Preston said, laying the filing out across the study table. "People with sudden wealth usually do, if only to avoid the headlines." "I'm not settling," I said. "I want this in a courtroom, on the record, permanently." In the 3 weeks before the hearing, the calls started. Unknown numbers. Then numbers I recognized. Then a pattern of texts that arrived late at night when I was least prepared for them. "Dad just wants to talk. Please call him back. You're really going to let a judge decide this? We're family, Marin. If you don't help us, we lose the house too. You'd really let that happen?" I read each one standing in the nursery doorway. watching Ren sleep, and typed back nothing at all. Preston had warned me they might escalate to something sharper once the legal route started looking uncertain, and he was right. The final message, 3 nights before the hearing, came from Cassidy directly. "You think money makes you better than us? You're still the same scared girl who needed our approval. That doesn't just disappear because you got lucky." I stared at that one longer than the others. Not because it hurt, though it did, in the old familiar way, but because I recognized, with a kind of distant clarity, that it was the last thing either of them would ever get to say to me that carried any weight at all. The hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning in a Duluth courtroom that smelled faintly of old radiators and floor wax. I walked in with Preston and Renata flanking me, Ren home with Miss Avery, and found my father already seated at the plaintiff's table beside an attorney who looked considerably more tired than confident. Cassidy wasn't with him. I learned afterward she'd stopped taking his calls 3 days after the security footage had quietly circulated through people who mattered to the case. Judge Eleanor Vance presided with a clipped, unhurried authority that filled the room without her raising her voice once. My father's attorney argued financial hardship, years of informal support given in good faith, a family entitled to look after its own in times of need. Preston, when his turn came, said very little before playing the footage. "You want shelter? Then earn it." The door, the lock clicking into place, the porch light going dark, deliberate, final. The judge's expression didn't change throughout, but her voice did when she finally spoke. "Mr. Ashworth, this court does not award damages to a parent for the natural consequences of decisions he made freely, and certainly not from an estate to which he has no legal claim whatsoever." She reviewed the filing once more, her tone hardening slightly. "This claim is dismissed, with prejudice. I'll also note for the record that the footage submitted today may be of considerable interest to other matters entirely, should anyone wish to pursue them." My father didn't look at me on his way out of the courtroom. I found I didn't need him to. The months that followed didn't move the way I expected them to. Not with the dramatic clarity of a single courtroom victory, but slowly, in the accumulation of ordinary days that, one after another, started to feel like they belonged to me. I moved into the Callaway residence permanently that spring, though residence undersold it considerably. A converted lakeside estate on the edge of the city that Vivian had apparently used more as a working headquarters than a home in her later years. Renata helped me convert one of the unused wings into something that actually felt lived in, with Ren's toys scattered across a playroom that got morning sun through floor-to-ceiling windows, and a small reading nook where I started, slowly, to remember what it felt like to sit still without waiting for the next demand on my time. The company itself took longer to feel like mine. For the first several months, I sat in on meetings mostly to listen, deferring to Renata's judgment on operational matters I didn't yet understand, absorbing terminology and strategy the way I'd once absorbed anatomy textbooks during nursing school. Slowly, then all at once. Preston walked me through governance structures, board relationships, the particular diplomacy required of someone who'd inherited authority, rather than earned it through decades of visible work. There were executives, I knew, who quietly doubted whether a 29-year-old ER nurse could actually run a $400 million freight company. I didn't blame them for wondering. Some mornings, driving into headquarters, I wondered too. It was Renata who finally said something that stuck with me. Maybe 3 months in, after a board meeting where I'd fumbled through a question about fleet financing, I should have known the answer to. "You keep apologizing for not already knowing things," she said afterward, over coffee in her office. Vivian didn't know any of this either, when she started. She learned it by doing it badly first, for a long time, until she didn't anymore. Nobody in that room expects you to already be her. They're watching to see if you're willing to become someone just as capable, in your own way. I held on to that more than I let on. Slowly, the fumbling questions became fewer. The terminology stopped requiring translation in my head before I could respond to it. By early summer, I'd started proposing changes of my own, smaller things at first, adjustments to driver scheduling that reduced turnover, a benefits restructuring that Renata later told me Vivian herself had wanted to implement for years, but never found the right moment to push through the board. "You have her instincts," Renata told me once, not long after the benefits change passed unanimously. Not her exact methods, her instincts. I think that's what she was hoping for, honestly. More than a carbon copy of herself. Ren adjusted faster than I did, in the particular unbothered way small children absorb enormous change without fully registering its size. She started calling the estate's garden terrace our yard within the first month, and by summer she'd taken to introducing herself to visiting executives with an easy confidence that made Renata laugh more than once. "Ren Ashworth," she'd announce, extending her small hand exactly the way she'd seen Renata do it. "I'm 4. My mommy has a truck company." I never told her the full story, not yet. She was too young for the specific weight of it, but I made a quiet decision early on that when she was old enough to ask, I'd tell her everything, unflinchingly, the porch and the storm and all of it, because I never wanted her growing up believing that families like the one I'd escaped were simply something you endured in silence. That August, almost exactly a year after the hearing, Preston brought me a message I hadn't expected. My father, he explained, had applied, under a different last name, one belonging to a cousin I barely remembered, for assistance through the Callaway Foundation, the charitable initiative I'd started that spring with a portion of the company's annual profits, aimed at helping people leave financially exploitative family situations. It hadn't taken the intake team long to verify who the applicant actually was. "The shop finally closed for good in June," Preston said. "Cassidy moved out of state sometime in the spring, from what we can tell. He's applying for housing assistance and job placement support. We can reject the application on grounds of conflict of interest, without any complication." I sat with that information longer than I expected to. It had been over a year since the courtroom, over a year since I'd heard either of their voices directly, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that the old sharp anger had dulled into something quieter. Not forgiveness exactly, but something closer to distance. The particular ache of an old bruise that no longer flares when pressed, just registers, faintly, that it was once there. "Don't reject it outright," I said finally. "Redirect him to one of our partner programs instead. One we're not directly affiliated with. He can get help, just not from me specifically." Preston studied me for a moment, something like quiet respect crossing his face. "That's more generous than most people would manage, under the circumstances." "It's not generosity," I said. "It's boundaries. There's a difference. I don't want anything to do with him directly, ever again. But I also don't need him to suffer for me to feel like the last year meant something." He nodded slowly, making a note. "I'll have the team arrange it quietly." That evening I sat on the terrace with Ren as the sun went down over the lake, her small body curled against my side, already half asleep after a long day of splashing in the shallow end of the pool Vivian had apparently had installed the same year I was born, according to the maintenance records Renata had shown me once, almost as if some small part of her had been preparing for a family she hoped might someday find their way there. "Mommy," Ren mumbled, eyes already closing. "Are we staying here forever?" "Forever," I said, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "This is ours now, sweetheart. Nobody's going to take it away." She hummed something contented and drifted the rest of the way to sleep against my shoulder, and I sat there a long while after, watching the light fade slowly over the water, thinking about a woman I'd never gotten the chance to meet, who had spent years quietly making sure that whatever happened to me, I'd eventually land somewhere safe. I hadn't been able to thank her in person, but I could, I realized, spend the rest of my life making sure the inheritance she'd left me meant something beyond the number attached to it. 2 years after the hearing, I stood backstage at a conference center in Minneapolis, going over note cards I'd already memorized twice, while Ren sat cross-legged on the floor beside me with a coloring book, entirely unbothered by the fact that nearly 1,000 people were filling the auditorium on the other side of the curtain. The invitation had come through the Callaway Foundation's regional partners, a leadership summit focused on resilience and organizational recovery, and somewhere in the planning process, someone had decided that the story of a nurse who'd inherited a freight empire and rebuilt it from a position of near-total collapse in her personal life was exactly the kind of talk their audience needed to hear. I'd said yes before I'd fully thought through what it would mean to say all of it out loud, to strangers, on a stage, with cameras recording every word. "You nervous?" Renata asked, appearing at my elbow with 2 coffees, handing me one. "Terrified," I admitted. "It's easier telling this story to a judge. At least she was required to listen." Renata laughed softly. "They're going to listen too. Just try to remember they're not the ones you're really talking to." She was right. In a way I didn't fully understand until I was already standing at the podium, the applause settling into an attentive hush, Wren watching from the wings with Miss Avery, clutching a stuffed fox she'd insisted on bringing for luck. 3 years ago, I began, my voice steadier than I expected, I stood in a snowstorm outside my father's house, holding my 4-year-old daughter against my chest, and I believed, with complete certainty, that my life was ending on that driveway. Today I run a $400 million freight company I didn't know existed a year before I inherited it. But this isn't a story about money. It's a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to protect you decide you're more useful broken than whole, and what happens after you refuse to stay that way. The room settled into the particular stillness that meant people were actually listening, not just waiting politely for their next coffee break. I told them about the shop, about 6 years of midnight wire transfers, about a trust my mother had specifically protected, and a father who'd tried to take it anyway. I told them about the driveway, the porch light, the cold. I didn't dwell on the worst of it longer than necessary, but I didn't soften it either. I'd learned, somewhere in the last 3 years, that softening the truth for other people's comfort was just another version of the silence I'd spent my whole life keeping. My father and my sister believed they got to decide what I was worth, I said. And for a long time so did I. But the thing about hitting the absolute bottom of what you thought your life could survive is that eventually, you look up and realize the only direction left is up. I told them about Vivian, a woman I'd never met, who had spent years trying to reach a family that kept refusing her, who had left me not just a fortune but a letter that undid, in a handful of sentences, more damage than a decade of therapy might have managed on its own. I'm not telling you this because I think I'm special, I said, near the end. I got a phone call that changed everything, and I know most people never do. What I want you to take from this isn't wait for your rich relative to save you. It's this. The version of your family that makes you feel small isn't the only version of family that exists. Sometimes it's the family you build afterward, co-workers who believe in you before you believe in yourself, a foundation that helps a stranger the way you once needed to be helped, a daughter who has no idea yet how much her existence kept you moving through the worst night of your life. That's family too. Sometimes it's the only kind that actually counts. I told them, finally, about the Callaway Foundation, the shelters, the legal aid programs, the job placement support we'd built specifically for people trying to leave situations that looked, in some version or another, like the one I'd left. We've helped just over 6,000 people in 2 years, I said, as the slide behind me shifted to photos Renata had helped curate. Women in job training programs, families in transitional housing, a wall of thank you letters we kept in the foundation's main office. I didn't build this to be anyone's hero. I built it because someone finally taught me that a closed door doesn't mean there isn't another one waiting to open somewhere else. I wanted other people to find that door faster than I did. The applause when I finished lasted longer than I expected, warm and sustained, and when I stepped backstage, Wren ran to me immediately, tugging at the hem of my blazer. "Mommy, you did so good," she said. "Can I show you my picture now?" I crouched down and pulled her into a tight hug, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, letting the adrenaline of the last 20 minutes settle slowly into something calmer. "I want to see everything you made, sweetheart. Every single page." Renata approached with a quiet, satisfied smile. "You moved that entire room." "I just told the truth," I said, still a little breathless. "Turns out that's harder and easier than I expected, at the same time. That's usually exactly what people need to hear," she said. As the crowd filtered slowly out of the auditorium, a young woman approached hesitantly, her hands twisting together in front of her. "Ms. Ashworth," she said quietly, "I just wanted to say, I left a situation a lot like yours, 6 months ago. Your foundation helped me with the legal fees I couldn't afford on my own. I don't think I'd have found the courage without knowing someone else had actually survived it and come out the other side." I held her gaze steadily, the way Preston had once held mine in a cold recovery room 3 years earlier. "You're the one who left," I told her. "That took courage that had nothing to do with me. Be proud of that part specifically. I just helped with the paperwork." She smiled, something loosening visibly in her shoulders, and thanked me again before disappearing back into the crowd. That evening, back at the estate, I sat on the terrace long after Wren had gone to sleep, a blanket around my shoulders against the cool lake air, the city lights glimmering faintly on the water in the distance. I thought about the porch, the storm, the particular kind of cold that convinces you, in the moment, that it's the only kind of ending available to you. I thought about Vivian, a woman I'd never gotten to thank in person, who had quietly made sure that ending never actually arrived. I understood something then that I hadn't fully let myself believe until that exact moment. The greatest revenge, if that was even still the right word for it anymore, was never going to be the courtroom victory, or the $400 million, or even the look on my father's face when he realized exactly who he'd been asking for a loan. It was this: an ordinary Tuesday evening, my daughter asleep safely down the hall, a life I'd built rather than merely survived, spread out quietly in front of me with nothing left to prove to anyone who'd once tried to convince me I wasn't worth keeping warm. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, I hope you take this one thing with you. The people who are supposed to protect you don't always get to decide what you're worth. Sometimes the door that closes behind you is exactly what finally sends you looking for the one that was always meant to open. If this story meant something to you today, if it reminded you of your own strength, or a door you're still waiting to walk through yourself, like this video, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and subscribe for more stories about resilience, boundaries, and starting over when everything tells you that you can't. You are not alone in this. You are not what happened to you. And the storm, whatever shape it takes in your own life, really does end eventually.